Imagine this: an empire built not on soldiers or tanks, but on numbers, loans, and promises. For nearly 80 years, the International Monetary Fund, better known as the IMF, has dictated the fate of nations. It told governments when to tighten their belts, when to cut food subsidies, when to privatize water or electricity. And for just as long, Africa has been at the mercy of those commands. But something extraordinary just happened. For the first time in decades, a frontline nation, Ghana, has stood up and said no. No more crushing interest rates, no more policies that make the rich richer and leave the poor hungrier. And standing right beside them, the fiery young leader of Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, declared that Africa will not bow to Washington's financial dictates. Together, Ghana and Traoré have lit a fuse that many believe could mark the beginning of the IMF's collapse. Think about the weight of that moment. A continent once silenced is now speaking in thunder. The rebellion is not fought with bullets, but with defiance, with unity, with a refusal to accept financial slavery. Western headlines call it dangerous. African voices call it liberation. And you watching this right now must ask yourself, is this really the start of a global financial revolution, or just another protest destined to be crushed? One thing is certain: Africa's rebellion has begun, and the world is watching. So stay with me, because in the next few minutes we'll uncover what Ghana dared to say, how Ibrahim Traoré turned defiance into strategy, and why this could be the greatest challenge the IMF has faced in its history. Please share this video if you feel you are among the first to witness Africa's rebellion take shape, and subscribe if you believe that truth is more important than the headlines. For years, Ghana was seen as one of the IMF's model students. Accra borrowed, signed the agreements, and carried out the reforms. Public wages were frozen. Food and fuel subsidies were cut. Farmers paid more for seeds and fertilizers, while the price of cocoa, the nation's lifeline, was dictated abroad. On paper, the IMF called it stability. On the ground, ordinary Ghanaians called it suffering. Families watched the cost of living spiral, while schools and hospitals were starved of funds. By early 2025, the breaking point had been reached. Ghana's debt-to-GDP ratio crossed 100%. Inflation surged. Young people filled the streets of Accra, chanting against IMF conditions. Even the central bank admitted that the so-called rescue packages were turning into shackles. And then, in a move that shocked both Washington and Brussels, Ghana's finance minister stood before cameras and declared, "We will no longer allow IMF prescriptions to destroy our future." That single statement ignited a storm. It wasn't just about numbers, it was about dignity. Ghana, a nation once praised for being obedient to the IMF, had just broken ranks. For the first time in decades, a major African state openly accused the fund of perpetuating a cycle of dependency instead of providing solutions. And almost immediately across the Sahel, Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso raised his voice in solidarity. In Ouagadougou, he reminded the world that Burkina Faso had long rejected IMF dictates, choosing instead to nationalize gold, expel exploitative companies, and seek alternative partnerships with Russia, India, and other allies. His words were sharp, direct. "We will not kneel before the IMF. Africa's wealth will no longer serve foreign masters." The symbolism was powerful. Ghana, the coastal nation long aligned with Western finance, and Burkina Faso, the revolutionary state challenging neocolonialism, were now speaking in unison. Their defiance carried a message larger than themselves. If Ghana could resist, if Burkina Faso could resist, then perhaps the rest of Africa could as well. Western media immediately framed the decision as reckless. The Financial Times warned of economic suicide. The Wall Street Journal called Ghana's rejection a dangerous populist gamble. But African voices told a different story. Radio stations in Nairobi, Lagos, and Dakar broadcasted the speeches live, calling them historic. Commentators compared the moment to the anti-colonial struggles of the 1950s and 1960s, when nations first broke free of European rule. The facts were undeniable. Ghana had defaulted on more than 30 billion in external debt, much of it tied to IMF conditions. Burkina Faso had cut ties with French banks and launched plans for an African-controlled financial system. And now both were daring to imagine a continent beyond the IMF's grip. Inside Africa, the ripple effects were immediate. In Mali, the government hinted at renegotiating its IMF package. In Senegal, youth movements demanded their leaders follow Ghana's example. Even in Kenya, opposition politicians cited Ghana's courage as proof that the chains can be broken. The IMF, meanwhile, scrambled. Officials in Washington quietly contacted Ghanaian negotiators, offering softer repayment terms and new promises. But the damage was done. The image of a confident Ghana standing tall and a fiery Traore backing them up had already spread like wildfire. What made the moment even more significant was timing. 2025 was already a year of economic turmoil. Global interest rates were climbing, Western economies were slowing, and BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, were openly discussing a new reserve currency to rival the dollar. Into that storm, Ghana and Burkina Faso had thrown a spark. The spark was simple yet radical. Africa does not need the IMF to survive. It is here at this precise turning point that history begins to shift. Ghana's defiance was not a technical decision about debt. It was a political decision about freedom. And Ibrahim Traoré's echo of that defiance transformed it from a single act of resistance into a continental declaration. This was the event. This was the moment when the illusion cracked, when the IMF for the first time in decades looked vulnerable on African soil. When Ghana's finance minister declared independence from the IMF and Captain Ibrahim Traoré amplified the message, the reaction across Africa and beyond was immediate, like a lightning bolt splitting the sky. In Accra, thousands poured into the streets waving placards that read, IMF Accra chains, and we want sovereignty, not loans. Market women who had seen food prices triple under IMF programs shouted with joy that at last someone is speaking for us. University students painted murals of Traoré alongside Ghanaian independence heroes like Kwame Nkrumah, symbolizing a new generation reclaiming an old dream. But the government's defiance also unleashed fear. International credit rating agencies Moody's, Fitch, Standard & Poor's downgraded Ghana overnight, warning investors to pull out. The Ghanaian currency wobbled. Yet, rather than weakening the rebellion, these threats only seemed to harden public resolve. We have been poor under the IMF. We cannot be worse without it, one protester said on live television, his voice shaking with both anger and hope. In Burkina Faso, the momentum was even more visceral. Ibrahim Traoré called a National Assembly gathering unions, farmers, soldiers, and youth leaders. His words electrified the room. The IMF will not write Africa's future. We will. The applause lasted minutes. Days later, mass rallies filled Ouagadougou, not in protest, but in celebration. For once, the people were not resisting oppression, they were embracing freedom. Across the continent, the defiance spread like wildfire. In Nigeria, radio talk shows debated whether the government should cancel its own IMF-backed fuel subsidy reforms. In Kenya, opposition lawmakers praised Ghana and Burkina Faso, arguing that their own country was being strangled by loans dressed as aid. Even in South Africa, analysts on mainstream TV admitted the IMF's credibility was cracking. Meanwhile, in Washington and Brussels, alarm bells rang. The U.S. Treasury Department issued a statement warning that Ghana's decision could destabilize regional economies. The European Central Bank suggested that rejecting IMF conditions would isolate Africa from global capital markets. But behind closed doors, diplomats admitted the real fear. If one country got away with it, many others might follow. And indeed, that domino effect was already visible. Mali's transitional government announced a review of its IMF program. Niger, under sanctions but inspired by Traoré, hinted at creating a joint Sahel development bank. Rumors swirled that the African Union might table a proposal for a continental stabilization fund, something unimaginable just months earlier. The IMF itself scrambled to regain control. Its spokespersons offered softer rhetoric, promising to listen more closely to African partners. But on social media, Africans mocked the change of tone, calling it too little too late. Viral hashtags, #Imfexit, See Africa Rebels, Traore effect spread across Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. For millions of young Africans, this was not just economics. It was the birth of a movement. International reactions revealed the battle lines. Russia's foreign ministry praised Ghana and Burkina Faso, offering technical support for financial independence. China hinted at new bilateral credit lines outside IMF frameworks. India openly invited African states to join BRICS-led financial mechanisms. These gestures were more than symbolic, they signaled a global shift away from IMF dominance. But perhaps the most dramatic reaction came from within Africa itself. In a televised debate from Dakar, one scholar declared, "This is our Berlin Wall moment." The IMF wall is crumbling, and Ghana and Traoré just swung the hammer. The audience erupted in applause. Still, there was fear. Could Ghana withstand the market backlash? Could Burkina Faso endure sanctions or diplomatic isolation? Some warned that Western powers might retaliate by cutting aid, freezing assets, or supporting opposition movements. Yet for many Africans, the risk was worth it. As one Ghanaian youth leader said, slavery in chains or freedom in uncertainty, we choose freedom. The climax of this rebellion was not a single protest nor a single speech. It was the convergence of voices from Accra to Ouagadougou to Lagos declaring that the IMF no longer held moral authority. That unity, fragile but growing, represented a deeper rebellion than the IMF had ever faced in its history. In that sense, Ghana and Traore did not just light a spark, they unleashed a storm. The immediate shockwaves of Ghana's defiance and Traore's rallying cry were felt not only in parliaments and financial markets, but in the daily lives of ordinary Africans. For decades, IMF policies had determined the price of bread, the wages of teachers, and the future of farmers. Now, with one bold refusal, people began to ask, if our leaders no longer follow the IMF, what will that mean for us? In Ghana, the atmosphere shifted almost overnight. The same market vendors who once cursed IMF reforms began to express cautious hope. Mothers waiting in long lines for fuel said openly that they preferred hardship under their own government to ease dictated from abroad. For the first time in years, public debate turned not on how to survive IMF cuts, but on how to build alternatives, cooperatives for farmers, new trade links within Africa, and community banks to fund small businesses. Civil society organizations seized the moment. Student unions in Accra called for a People's Economic Charter demanding that any future financial system prioritize food, housing, and education. In the streets, graffiti artists painted slogans like "No IMF, no chains" across bridges and university walls. It wasn't just economics anymore. It was identity, dignity, and sovereignty. In Burkina Faso, the effects were even more visible. Traore's government began holding public forums where citizens could voice their visions for an economy free of external dictates. Farmers spoke of reclaiming seed independence. Miners demanded better wages from newly nationalized gold operations. Women's groups called for microcredit systems owned by local communities, not foreign lenders. For the first time, political discourse was being reshaped by ordinary people rather than foreign experts. But the rebellion carried risks. Critics warned that without IMF support, Ghana and Burkina Faso could face liquidity crises, shortages of foreign currency, or even sanctions. Western ambassadors whispered about political instability and hinted that aid could be cut. Inside both countries, opposition parties accused leaders of recklessness. Some predicted chaos if foreign investment fled. Yet, the response of the people revealed something deeper: fatigue with fear itself. "We have been afraid for too long," one Ghanaian taxi driver said. "Every time we protested, they told us without the IMF the sky would fall. The sky has not fallen, it is clearing." His words captured a new mood of defiance that no economic model could measure. Politically, the rebellion strengthened Traore's standing across Africa. In Burkina Faso, he was already celebrated as a revolutionary figure. Now, with Ghana at his side, his stature rose even higher. Newspapers in Mali and Niger portrayed him as the embodiment of Pan-African resistance. Youth activists in Kenya and South Africa wore T-shirts with his image, much like earlier generations wore Che Guevara. Ghana's leaders, meanwhile, found themselves unexpectedly popular at home. Despite the uncertainty, citizens respected the courage to break free. This shift had profound consequences for governance. For decades, leaders feared losing IMF approval more than losing public trust. Now the equation was reversed. Leaders realized that standing against IMF dictates could win them legitimacy among their people. It was a new political currency: sovereignty as power. The larger question, of course, was whether this spirit could survive the coming trials. Could Ghana stabilize its economy without IMF dollars? Could Burkina Faso withstand the combined pressure of sanctions, propaganda, and covert destabilization? No one knew for certain. But what had changed irreversibly was the belief that dependence was inevitable. For civil society, for political movements, and for ordinary citizens, the rebellion was already a victory. The IMF no longer felt untouchable. Africans had glimpsed the possibility of life beyond its shadow, and that glimpse, fragile, contested, yet undeniable, was enough to rewrite the political imagination of a continent. From Washington to Brussels, the rebellion led by Ghana and Burkina Faso was not seen as a local tremor. It was viewed as a tectonic shift, one that could unravel decades of carefully constructed financial architecture. In the United States, policymakers quickly recognized the danger. The IMF has always been more than a financial institution. It has been an instrument of American influence, a way to guide the policies of developing nations without deploying troops. To see Ghana, a longtime partner, reject IMF conditions outright was a direct challenge to that influence. Commentators on CNN and Bloomberg warned that if other African countries followed the U.S., could lose one of its quietest but most powerful levers of control. The State Department issued carefully worded statements urging Ghana to reconsider its commitments and portraying Traore as a destabilizing populist. Behind closed doors, officials reportedly discussed options ranging from diplomatic pressure to covert measures designed to fracture the rebellion before it spread. American think tanks began publishing papers on the risks of an IMF collapse scenario not only for Africa, but for the global economy. In Europe, the reaction was equally tense. France, already humiliated by its loss of military influence in the Sahel, now faced the prospect of losing economic leverage as well. Editorials in Paris described Traore as a symbol of dangerous radicalism, while German newspapers admitted with unease that Africa might turn toward BRICS for financial support. The European Union, caught between reliance on African resources and loyalty to Washington, issued mixed signals, warnings of instability paired with quiet attempts to open back-channel talks. Beyond the West, the rebellion was greeted with cautious optimism. Russia praised Ghana and Burkina Faso for breaking free of neo-colonial bondage. China, though more reserved, hinted at expanding bilateral credit systems and trade mechanisms outside of IMF channels. India was the most enthusiastic, openly inviting African nations to join alternative platforms within BRICS. For these rising powers, Africa's defiance was more than symbolic. It was an opportunity to build a multipolar financial world no longer centered on Washington. Global markets, meanwhile, were jittery. Investors worried about defaults spreading across Africa. Some predicted a wave of instability. Others argued that Africa was entering a long-overdue phase of financial independence. Wall Street firms downgraded African bonds, but African social media exploded with memes, mocking the downgrades as badges of honor. What made the situation so unprecedented was its potential domino effect. Africa is home to over 1.4 billion people, vast natural resources, and some of the world's fastest-growing economies. If enough African nations chose to defy the IMF, it would not simply be a regional story, it could threaten the very legitimacy of the institution itself. And without IMF leverage, America's ability to project financial power globally would be seriously weakened. This is why the world is watching so closely. For the West, the rebellion is a threat to order. For much of Africa, it is a moment of rebirth. For emerging powers, it is a chance to rewrite the rules of the game. But one question lingers in the air: is this the true beginning of the IMF's collapse, or merely a passing revolt that will be crushed under the weight of Western retaliation? History rarely announces itself with cannons or fireworks. Sometimes it begins with a quiet statement: no more. That is what Ghana declared to the IMF. That is what Captain Ibrahim Traoré echoed for Burkina Faso. And together, those words have shaken the pillars of a system that for decades seemed unbreakable. But rebellion is only the beginning. The path ahead is uncertain and perhaps even dangerous. Ghana still faces soaring debt and the threat of isolation. Burkina Faso remains under pressure from sanctions and covert attempts to destabilize its reforms. Western powers are unlikely to simply step aside and watch their financial dominance dissolve. Retaliation, whether economic, diplomatic, or even political, will come. The question is whether Africa's newfound unity can withstand it. This is the warning history whispers. Revolutions can inspire hope, but they can also trigger counterattacks. The IMF, for all its flaws, still commands trillions in capital and the loyalty of powerful nations. To openly challenge it is to enter a struggle far larger than one nation or one leader. It is to confront the weight of a global order built over generations. And yet something irreversible has already happened. Ordinary Africans, farmers, students, workers have glimpsed the possibility of freedom from financial slavery. Once that vision is seen, it cannot be unseen. Even if Ghana stumbles, even if Traoré is pressured, the seed of rebellion has been planted. Across the continent, people are asking dangerous, powerful questions. Do we really need the IMF? Do we really need permission from Washington to live with dignity? For Americans and Western viewers, this moment should not be dismissed as distant noise. It raises urgent questions for us too. If Africa breaks free, how will it reshape global trade, investment, and politics? Will the United States double down on control or finally accept a multipolar world where Africa stands as an equal? The truth is, no one knows how this story will end. But we know how it begins with courage, defiance, and the refusal to kneel. Ghana has spoken. Traore has spoken. And now a continent begins to stir. So I leave you with this. Do you believe this is the beginning of the IMF's collapse, or will the rebellion be crushed before it spreads? Can we trust leaders like Ibrahim Traoré to carry Africa through this storm, or should others rise to continue the fight? Please share this video if you feel Africa's rebellion is already underway, and subscribe if you believe that truth is more important than headlines. Your voice matters because silence has protected the IMF for too long.